You mean you didn't turn it on back there? Some things never change. Speaking of things that never change, the other visitors we have are some old friends from Winston-Salem. They don't live there anymore, but they were there when we were there. Brian and Kara Walker. Let me just say, don't listen to anything that they say. Nothing that they say is true. Unfortunately, everything they say will be true, and you've experienced it yourself the last few years. Okay, we are in Judges 8 and 9. We finished studying Gideon in a way, but I wanted to do some more study in him and how he leads to his son Abimelech, because this section is unlike the rest of Judges. In fact, the handout that I gave you, how Judges is organized chiastically, we find this is the center because they have a king. And Abimelech is the king. He's not generally considered the first king in Israel, but he is. And the book of Judges ends with, there was no king in Israel. And so the fact that he is king says that this is a significant part of the book. Now, I believe that another reason why we should study Genesis or Judges 8 and 9 together is all the judges, when you study them, the subsequent leader was a judge, but not a king, also was not related. And Abimelech is the son. Now, one of the questions that I love to ask is why. Michael has learned this summer, much to his chagrin, that he will say something and I will say why. He will give me an explanation, I will say why. And then he'll explain it some more and I say why, to the point where he either gets aggravated at me or he finally figures out why. So when you look at Abimelech, since he is the only king in the book of Judges and not a judge, the way my brain works is why? Why did Abimelech desire to be a king? Now we find his practical and manipulative monarchical idea when he said in Judges chapter 9, verses 1 through 2, it is better for you that 70 men, or is it better for you that 70 men, all the sons of Jerubbaal, rule over you, or that one man rule over you? Remember that I am your own flesh and blood. So Gideon has died. Gideon had 70 sons plus plus Abimelech. Jerubbaal is Gideon's other name. And so he is trying to fill the power vacuum. Yes?
He's their own flesh and blood, so isn't the 70 sons their own flesh and blood?
No, because Abimelech is actually the son of the concubine that Gideon had, who was from the city of Shechem. Any other questions? And Leon, I appreciate you asking a question I know the answer to, because that doesn't always happen. So where did this idea, this power play, originate? I suggested in our class on Sunday that it actually originated with the behavior of Gideon himself. And one of the hints is he named his son Abimelech. Now remember, they asked him, be our king, rule over you, rule over us, and your sons rule over us. Judges 8, verse 22. And he says no. And yet he names his son Abimelech. And if you look at the handout, what does the name Abimelech mean? My father is king. Now, he wasn't king in an organized position, but I think his behavior was more king-like than it should have been, and that was part of his downfall. Now, when you look at Gideon, he is both a man of faith. I mean, after all, he's mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 among the judges. Gideon, Barak, Jephthah, and Samson. But just because somebody is mentioned in the book of Hebrews as a hero of faith, does that mean they were perfect? Far from it. It can't. Nobody was perfect. And when you look at the list of judges, and you know the story of Samson, and he is listed as a hero of faith, would you say the majority of Samson's life was one of impeccable moral integrity? No. Then you have Jephthah. And what's the last thing that we know about Jephthah? He made a vow, whatever comes out of my house first, I will offer as a sacrifice. What or who came out of the house? Daughter. There is debate whether or not he actually offered her. We will get to that. I'm going to suggest he probably did. And that's a fact that these men of faith often had failures that the Bible records. Now, Gideon was a military leader. Was he successful as a military leader? Very much so. We looked at his battle plans. We looked at how he could rally people. And even though he started off, hiding and asking questions and didn't appear to be a man of valor, he actually became one. And so as a military leader or a judge who, in the sense of judges, is meting out God's justice by defeating the ones that oppress them, he was a success. And following his defeat of the Midians, anybody remember how many years of peace there was? 40. Okay. Othniel, there was 40. Ehud, there was 80. Gideon, there is 40. So there is success in his story. But I believe that the text also teaches us there is failure. After all, when we study the book of Judges, we said it is a book of grace, as we're emphasizing grace all this summer. The fact that there is a lot of grace within the book of Judges tells us there's also a lot of what in the book of Judges? Yeah, bad, sin, failure. And we see it within these people. And often the judges themselves, as you look at judges from beginning to end, there seems to be a degenerative line where their moral and their religious behavior is getting worse and worse and worse. In fact, that is actually stated in Judges chapter 2, where it says in verse 19, whenever the judge died, the Israelites would act even more corruptly than their fathers, following other gods to serve them and bow and worship to them. So morally, religiously, it is getting worse and worse. And we see that often within families. And we're going to see that within Gideon also. We're trying to figure out what to do with this story. What do we make of him? How do we see his being a judge and the effect it had on his son Abimelech? And as a hint, remember, Gideon received a name from his pagan city folk. What was the name that he was given? Jerubbaal. Okay, so Gideon was his birth name. And then after he knocked down the altar of Baal, then he was called Jerubbaal. And within his narrative, we will have both Gideon and Jerubbaal mentioned. But when we get to Judges chapter 9, the Holy Spirit does not use the name Gideon again. Only Jerubbaal, contending with Baal, which suggests maybe the fact that we know Abimelech and the people that he was with were definitely religious failures. They were worshiping other gods. So what do we know At the bottom of page 1, you will see that God raised up Gideon, that Gideon responded faithfully after test after test. Anybody remember how many tests he had? 4. Very good. Oftentimes when I ask questions, people will, bow their head, don't call on me, don't call on me, don't call on me. But if it's a number, sometimes I'll just do this. Anybody know how many? And the answer's right there. Because I want you to get the answer. So Gideon responded after test, after test, after test, after test. But unsurprisingly, the end of his narrative is tinged with failure. You see in Judges chapter 8, where it's said in verse 27, Gideon made an ephod from all of this and put it in Ophrah, his hometown. Then all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his household. And this culminates in the son of Abimelech becoming even a more exaggerated failure of Gideon. If you look at the top of page 2, Gideon becomes a prototype for Israel itself. The sins of the father become the sins of the son. Is that a repeated theme throughout the Old Testament? Very much so. And we see idolatry towards the end of Gideon's life, and we see it becoming worse with his son. Religious and moral failure become a family failure. Is that also a theme throughout the Old Testament? Very much so. And compromise becomes an outright rebellion. Do we also see that theme within the Old Testament? So Gideon, in a way, embodies the history of Israel. Compromise is one of the great sins of the book of Judges. And then it becomes outright rebellion in his son. Now, among the many compromises of Gideon is his many wives. Did God approve? We know that it happened, but didn't God warn about getting many wives? And in the stories where there were many wives, can you think of one that worked out peacefully and perfectly? No, never. So we find in Judges chapter 8, and this is again at the end of his story arc, he had many wives, including a concubine from Shechem. And Shechem was a pagan city. And when Abimelech presents himself as king, it is done in Shechem among his relatives who are pagans. And they take gifts from the temple of Baal, let's see, what's it called? Baal Berith, and give him 70 pieces of silver. So that's kind of an overview of what he failed at towards the end as it is recorded. Anybody got any questions or comments or disagreements so far? Good. Okay. You next look, Israel demands and receives a king. Now, I often have two theories when I teach Bible books, and that is, every Bible book can be understood within itself. For example, when you're studying 1 Corinthians, you don't need to go to Acts to understand it. Although there's a historical overlap in some of it, the letter itself could be understood by the letter itself. But that does not mean that there are not several connections throughout the Old and the New Testament. After all, there's one author. Don't worry, Michael, I'm not going to step on your line this morning. There's one author, and that is the Holy Spirit. And you know that when Samuel was the last judge, What did Israel want? They wanted a king. So we're going to see as Israel demands and receives a king, and you think, okay, that must be during the time of Samuel and Saul. Nope, it's a time of Judges. Judges chapter 8:22, the Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you as well as your sons and your grandsons, for you delivered us from the power of Midian. Now, where would Israel get this idea of wanting a king? Absolutely. So all the nations around them have kings. That's the excuse that they give later on. Looking within Judges, what do we see as a continual story arc? It begins with sin, then there's the suffering, then there's the supplication, then there's the Savior, then there's the security, then there's the sin again. Okay? The Savior is the deliverer. Who is that deliverer within this book? Okay, Gideon and the judges. Okay, so their history right now is they have a judge, they have a period of peace, the judge dies, they fall into sin, then the suffering starts again, and so this cycle's going over and over and over and over again. Now, from a totally humanistic, practical perspective, does their request of Gideon make sense? Be a king over us, you and your sons, for you have delivered us from Midian. Does that make sense? Just from a practical perspective. It does. What's the problem with the request? That's right. God did not tell them to have a king. And there's a very valuable lesson here. What's that very valuable lesson? Look up to God. What else? Don't do things that God doesn't authorize. What else? Just because it's a good idea does not mean it's a God idea. How many times do people come up with good ideas? Lots of times. But just because something's a good idea does not mean it's a God idea. And their wanting a king was not a God idea. As we see with Samuel, they got one, but it was not at God's command. It was at their wish. Okay, so when Gideon is asked to become king, does he give the correct answer? Yes, he does. And what Gideon verbally refused, I won't become king, Abimelech offers in Judges chapter 9, and he becomes. Judges 9, verse 6. So let's look at Gideon. I say he is a king. It should say not a king, but not in name only. I didn't print that out. He lives like a king, but he refuses the title is what I'm trying to say. I hate when I make mistakes after all the proofreading. Okay. He said, no, I'm not going to be your king. But let's just ask this question. Do people ever say one thing and do the exact opposite? All the time. I think that's what's going on here. And I am doing this special study with you as a thought exercise. You don't have to agree with me, but you can help me think through it. Okay, so the questions I'm raising are, did Gideon act like a king in lifestyle but not name? Did Abimelech go further than his father and become king in lifestyle and name? And did Gideon have an untoward influence on his son Abimelech? Now, when Gideon says, no, I won't become king, you can take that at face value. And if the narrative ended with a period right there or an exclamation mark without anything else, then that would be totally different. But does the narrative end with a period or an exclamation mark after he says, I won't be king? Let's see what he does. Gideon requests a portion of their battle spoil. Let me make a request of you. Everyone give me an earring from his plunder. Chapter 8, verse 24. And they agreed. And the weight of the gold was 43 pounds of gold. That's a lot of earrings. Okay? Kings were famous for taxing. In fact, that was one of the downfalls of Saul. 2, Gideon makes, not Saul, Solomon. Gideon makes an ephod, chapter 8, 27, which is a priestly garment. Is Gideon a Levite? No. What tribe is he from? He is from Manasseh. Okay, so what reason would he have for making an priestly garment, which is an ephod? And I don't have this in your notes. Later on in the epilogue of Judges, you're going to have Micah, who is going to make himself priest, and he's also going to make an ephod. So that doesn't give good light on Gideon making an ephod. Now, can you think of any kings that acted as priests when they should not have? Saul. We'll be coming to that again later on. There was another king in the southern kingdom. He was given leprosy. Nobody can remember his name? Because I forgot to look it up. I just remember he was given leprosy, and it starts with a U. Is it Uzziah? Uzziah. Thank you. We have a third statement. Part of Gideon's spoil in chapter 8, verse 26 was he received what? Kingly robes. Why are we giving these details? Number 4, Gideon had many wives and 70 sons, plus one Abimelech. You don't find that behavior among the judges. Do you find this behavior among kings, having many wives? Yes. In fact, from my research, only 2 people in the Old Testament had more children than Gideon, and both of them were kings, Ahab and Rehoboam. And a 5th reason that it looks like Gideon's actions speak louder than words. At the beginning, as I pointed out, he names his son Abimelech. And what does Abimelech mean? My father is king. Now, one might be able to argue, well, maybe he means my father in heaven is king. There's a problem with that. Anybody know what that problem is? Yeah, they didn't really call God a father that often. You see, some language, Israel is my son, but you find in the New Testament it's far more common that my father is God.
If he had been named something that meant Yahweh is king, we could probably believe.
Okay, if Yahweh is king, that would be more. There's another reason why it's hard to picture him being named Abimelech as a reference to God as Father, Yahweh as Father. In the book of Genesis, Abimelech is the name or title of a Philistine king. So it seems more Canaanite than Hebrew. And we see some influence from the pagan religions within the story of of Gideon.
Involved here that some of his wives were in fact not of Jewish descent.
It's possible. We just know about one. Jared.
Correct me, but
You're wrong.
Abba, in relation to God, was a very personal Hebrew phrase, not something that you would use in an honorific title like this.
Right.
Right?
You find in the Old Testament, Israel as a nation is pictured as the son of God, making God the Father. But you don't find individuals pictured that way until you get to the New Testament, where Jesus in the Lord's Prayer said, "Our Father," and used the term Abba, which is very personal. Anybody else? Okay, you look at the next part. Why, we talked about this in the introduction, why the book of Judges was written. Every book has 3 periods: when lived, when written, and when read. And those that take a conservative perspective on the authorship of Judges believe Samuel was the author, and one of the reasons was to establish the Davidic dynasty, that is of David, because it ends with there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, showing that there was a relation between those two. And Samuel probably also wrote Ruth, and Ruth ends with what? Lineage to David. Yeah. So both of them seem to be boistering David. So in one sense, you could say there's a political motive here in writing the book of Judges. Now, when you look at this, one of the things that I often see within the Bible is how people mirror one another. Now, we know that this is a biblical concept. John the Baptist mirrored who? Elijah. And David was the son of, or excuse me, Jesus was the son. I gave you the answer. You're so smart, Brian. And so you have, this type and this anti-type where people are connected by their lives. And you heard me say again and again and again, the Bible keeps telling the same stories over and over and over again, just with different people in different situations. So if he is trying to if Samuel is trying to boister David over Saul, then he might show some comparisons that are not necessarily the best, but necessarily show comparisons. You look at under Gideon and Saul, and I was surprised personally at how many comparisons there were. When we find Gideon, what is he doing? In Genesis, I keep saying Genesis because I love Genesis. In Judges chapter 6, where is Gideon when we first find him? No. Gideon, he's in the wine press. What's he doing in the wine press? Hiding. He's threshing out the wheat so he could be hidden, so that he could hide from the Midians. So we find Gideon hiding when he is called. When Saul is called, is he hiding? If I'm doing comparisons, the answer would be yes. Anybody remember where Saul is hiding? In the baggage? The luggage? What was that? That will be later. He will, but at the beginning, he is hiding in the baggage. Right? So both hide. Both verbally did not claim to be king. Now, Gideon said, "I won't do it," but I think his actions show that he did. And after Saul was first privately anointed, he didn't mention it. Both were successful in warfare when they were called. Both wrongly acted as priests, because I think that's what Gideon did when he made the ephod, which is a priestly garment, and took it to Ophrah, his hometown. He didn't take it to the tabernacle. Anybody remember what Saul did that was wrong as a priest? Yeah. And Samuel was very upset when he showed up. Both have records including paganistic error. We have the ephod being turned into an idol, and we have Gideon marrying a woman from, not marrying, having as a concubine a woman from Shechem, and we find that idolatry plagued or was a snare to Gideon and his household. What paganistic error did Saul make? I wouldn't say he was an idol worshiper, but there was one event in his life that was tinged with paganism. Okay, let me ask you this question. Were Israelites allowed to go to witches? No. Witches were forbidden. What does Saul do towards the end of his reign? He goes to the witch of Endor. That was paganistic, because a witch was not allowed to be in God's declaration under Moses. And both have sons that lead to civil war. The son of Gideon is Abimelech. And who is the son of Saul that led to civil war? Nope, Jonathan. Rehoboam was the son of Solomon. Ishbosheth. Y'all remember Ishbosheth? Barely. It wasn't a very successful civil war. But after Saul died, Saul's general made his son Ishbosheth king. And some of the tribes followed him, but some of the tribes followed Judah. Some of the tribes followed David. So we see a lot of connections between Gideon and Saul. We see connections between Abimelech and Saul. Well, when we consider Abimelech's story, we do. Both tried to kill their perceived rivals. Who did Abimelech try to kill? Jotham. Who did Saul try to kill? Both requested, and this I just find interesting, both requested their armor bearer to kill them so that they would not suffer shame. How was it with Abimelech? Anybody remember that story? Millstone. Yeah, a millstone was dropped by a woman, and it would have been shameful for him to be killed by a woman, so he told his armor bearer, please strike me, so it won't be said that I was killed by a woman. And yet to this day, how do we say he was killed? By a woman. Saul is fighting the Philistines. He is wounded. He asks his armor bearer to kill him. Strike me through, so I will not be made sport of, as some translations say, by the enemy. But the armor bearer refused. But they both made the same request. When you look at the conclusion, it may be hard to determine when Gideon's downfall began, but I do believe that the text reads it as a downfall. I suggested it is when he had as his battle cry for Yahweh and God, a sword for Yahweh and Gideon, a Yahweh for Gideon, because I don't see any other judge doing that. And even when Saul was having a rally cry, he didn't say, do it for me and Yahweh. He said, follow Samuel and me. And yet God said at the beginning, I want you to lower the number from 32,000, 22,000 left, 10,000 were remained. Then he gave another test for how to choose it. How many remained out of the 300? Why did God say he wanted only 300? And doesn't Gideon seem to be claiming the victory is his? Now, since Judges is about the denigration of personal and national morals and religion, what is the moral of this story? I think it's poignant. Don't act like what you don't want your children to become. That's pretty poignant, isn't it? Don't act. Even though I'm not king, he sure acted like it. Don't act like what you don't want your children to become. Now that's our special study on the downfall of Gideon and the rise of Abimelech. Anybody got any questions, comments, or disagreements before we get in the last 10 minutes of class and we get into the text itself? Now, I will say this. I had fun doing this. I don't know if you had fun me doing this, but I had fun doing this because I think it gets us deeper into what is going on in the story and it keeps us from having just a peripheral view, but helps us get into why is the text telling us what it is telling us. Again, the question why. Okay, Judges chapter 9, starting in verse 1. Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal. Now remember, after the death of Gideon, in the story arc of Abimelech, he is no longer called Gideon, but only by the name Jerubbaal, which was given to him by the people of the city where he was from after he knocked down the altar to Baal. He went to Shechem. In Genesis, Shechem does not have a very positive history. Anybody remember what happened there? Yes. Dinah was violated by the son of the king. He wanted to marry her, so two sons of Jacob made a deal that if you circumcise your men, then we can intermingle. And when they were recovering from that surgery, what did the sons do? They attacked them. This is Shechem. Okay. He spoke to his uncles and his mother's whole clan, saying, "Please speak in the hearing of all the citizens of Shechem." So, we're learning how to do bad things. If you want to do bad things, one of the first things you need to do is get a small group of people on your side. Doesn't that often happen? Get a small group on your side. Does that ever happen in a church? Yes, it does. Can that also happen in a family where a child will pit one parent against the other? Yeah, get somebody on your side. That's what he's doing. Please speak in the hearing of all the citizens of Shechem. Now, this is to, who's he saying this to specifically? His mother's family. And then he says, is it better for 70 men to rule over you? That's the same word that is used when they said, rule over us. Now, there's no indication that these sons were trying to rule, but I do suggest to you that is the lifestyle of Gideon. Or is it better that one man rule over you? Well, again, from a practical perspective, what makes more sense? 70 men or one? One. Let me ask you this question. You look at how denominations are organized. From a practical perspective, do they have a whole group of people leading them, or do they generally have one? They have one. So from a practical perspective, it makes sense. But then we got to always remember, just because something is a good idea does not make it a God idea. Okay? So his mother's relatives spoke all these words in the hearing of the citizens, and they were favorable to Abimelech. He is our brother. So they gave him 70 pieces of silver from the temple of Baal-berith. So we see paganism here. And Abimelech used it to hire who? Worthless, reckless men. I looked up the word worthless because I was curious if it was the same as another word. And it wasn't, but it has a very poignant meaning. The word worthless literally means empty. Hire empty men. Now, what do you think that means, to hire empty men? Yes, men. Yeah. What was that, Mark?
Empty of morality.
Empty of morality. Anybody else? No strength. Anybody else? Okay, they might, I don't know, but they were worthless. They were empty.
And hire them to do your purpose.
And that's exactly what happens. And they followed him. He went to his father's house in Ophrah, and what does he do? Kills 70 brothers. Well, not quite. One gets away. Is that another theme in the Bible? How there's one left? Yeah. I alone escaped. Do you remember when Athaliah committed the treasonous act of becoming queen after her son died? What did she do? Killed all the royal seed, all the sons and grandsons. But one escaped. This is a constant theme throughout the Bible. One. And they killed everyone on top of a large stone. What word would you use to describe how they were killed? Brutally? Beheaded? Anybody else got a word to describe? 69 brothers of the leader, 69 men, all killed on one stone. Any other words to describe it? You know, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? The word that comes to my mind is, this is a massacre. Execution. Yeah. None of the words that I think of are good words. But the youngest son survived because he hid. Then all the citizens of Shechem and of Beth Millo gathered together and proceeded to make Abimelech king at the oak of the pillar in Shechem. From a historical perspective, was it common when a new dynasty, or even when there was going to be an uprising within a particular dynasty, was it common for there to be a mass execution? Very much so. And then we have Jotham's parable. Now, my man-made heading calls this a parable. I think it's more of a fable than a parable. Anybody know why I might think it's more of a fable than a parable? Trees are talking, right? Jesus was famous for speaking in parables. Okay? The word parable literally means, I understand, a laying down beside of. And that's what he's doing. So in a general sense, it is a parable. But in a specific sense, it is a fable. Anybody know of somebody who was famous for their fables? Aesop. Okay? So we have talking trees. And on Wednesday, we will talk about talking trees. Anybody got any questions, comments, or disagreements? Thank you for this class. I thoroughly enjoyed it.